one has to realize this airport, while it back in 1960, 70 and so forth was all by itself out in the field somewhere, over time, as the community grew, houses were built around the airport. Obviously well knowing that, hey, here's an airport and my house is now close to an airport. But that's besides the point. The community, San Jose, grew, and there are now 1 million people in this area. And obviously there's pressure for affordable housing, parks, you name it.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 93 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and safety tips that pilots and student pilots like you can use someday. And you just heard Walt Geiger, and after the news, I'll be sitting down with Walt to talk about the threatened closure of San Jose's Reid-Hillview Airport and what pilots can be doing to help preserve their own airport. Plus, this week in the news, the U.S. government is partially shut down, and we'll talk about how the shutdown is affecting aviation. Rolls-Royce is attempting a speed record with an electric airplane, and a former pilot may be getting up to 2 years in prison for flying without a valid certificate. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott. I'm your host. I'm here to educate and inform you and have some fun along the way. If you're new to the show, I'm the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year, and these days I specialize in Cirrus, like the SR-20, 22, and SF-50 Vision Jet. So if you're starting to think that someday you might want to buy one of these or you'd like training in one, please contact me today for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight if you're thinking about a new aircraft. Last week in episode 92, we talked with Scott Denstead about his new book, Pilot Weather, From Solo to the Airlines. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. All this and more, and the news starts now. From the WashingtonPost.com, NATCA, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, says that cracks are starting to show as 3,000 support workers have been furloughed and nearly 10,500 air traffic controllers continue to work without pay due to the government shutdown. Paul Rinaldi, president of NATCA, warned Congress that its controllers work in a system that, quote, has no room for error. Right now, we are asking our controllers to maintain the safety and efficiency of the system without the necessary contribution of 3,000 safety professionals. He said, we wouldn't ask a surgeon to perform an operation without the assistance of a support team, and we shouldn't be asking air traffic controllers to continue working without support staff. The shutdown also means the FAA and the National Transportation Safety Board have had to prioritize their crash investigations. Small plane crashes in Florida and South Dakota and 2 crashes in Michigan that killed a total of 5 people have not received NTSB scrutiny. But the most notable of the union's fears, and the one that ultimately could slow down air traffic control, is the supply of certified air traffic controllers. Our friend Rob Mark wrote in FlyingMagazine.com that there are fewer fully trained controllers on the job now than at any point in the past 30 years. He said the recent shutdown, though, has made the controller shortage worse because the agency's training academy in Oklahoma City is now dark. He says that means no new controllers are on hand to begin or continue learning the business. Wait much longer, NATCA says, and some classes might be canceled completely, which would lead to fewer new hires by the FAA in fiscal 2019. Now, nearly 1 in 5 working controllers, about 18%, are also eligible to retire, and there are concerns that the shutdown will lead to some controllers retiring immediately. And apparently that's actually happening. I saw a Facebook post last week from an ATC supervisor at a facility that he said had fewer than 20 controllers, and he said that 2 of his controllers have already told him that they are turning in their retirement papers this week. But according to the Washington Post, those workers may be in limbo because the people who will receive that retirement paperwork have also been furloughed. Now, Jason Blair, one of our Patreon supporters, has written on his jasonblair.net website about some of the other effects of the shutdown, including, he says, PSI CATS, the provider of FAA knowledge test, has notified people that we have been authorized to resume FAA airman knowledge testing. However, please be advised that during the shutdown, we cannot guarantee that results will be accurately processed after airman knowledge testing data is transferred to the FAA. Jason writes that the practical application of this is that knowledge tests will allow an applicant to qualify a practical test, but since it's unlikely to sync to the master FAA database, any practical test or check ride that you take would not be able to be done using IACRA. That's the online system that's used for most check rides, and that those tests would have to be done using a Paper 87 form with the examiner. He continues, regarding FAA practical test, as of this writing, there is no indication of any stoppage of most practical test administration. In fact, he says it's been directly conveyed to the Flight School Association of North America that, quote, airman practical testing may continue during government shutdown when conducted by designees. And that means when you go to a designated pilot examiner who is not an FAA employee. Part 135 line checks, he says that any charter operators that have line checks scheduled with FAA staff should plan on them not happening while any government shutdown is taking place. He says when the staff does get back to the office, there may be some scheduling catch-up required to take care of the backlog of line checks. Regarding certification processing of paperwork for folks who are taking a check ride, he says, while the FAA staff is out on furlough, it is assumed that any practical test applications will be placed in the in-basket and await final processing by FAA staff. And he said that's going to happen after staff returns. He says, while we typically see processing times for practical tests between 60 to 90 days, the FAA does allow for the temporary airman certificates granted by DPEs when completing practical test validity for up to 120 days. It's possible that the furlough will create further delays in the processing of new certificates. And he says anyone planning on attending an FAA safety team wing seminar being conducted by FAA staff should probably plan on them not happening. Now, separately, I've read that the FAA will not be scheduling any new FAA wing seminars during the FAA shutdown, as the FAA employees that approve new seminars and send emails to pilots notifying them of newly scheduled seminars are on furlough. From PistonHeads.com comes a story that a British aviation firm is making a three-motor craft that will be capable of a record-breaking 300 miles per hour and a 200-mile range. All this in an electric aircraft. So they're trying to demonstrate the validity of electrical power in the skies. And so Rolls-Royce is developing a zero-emission aircraft to break the E-plane air speed record in 2020 as part of its, quote, accelerating the electrification of flight. The story says that the firm, which operates completely separate from the Rolls-Royce car firm but shares the same name, will have to beat the 210-mile-per-hour record set by Siemens and its E-plane back in 2017. Rolls has confidently stated that it plans to blow the doors off that speed. Engineers are said to be aiming for 343 miles per hour, which would match the speed of the Supermarine, a Rolls-Royce V12-powered seaplane that broke its class record in 1931. Using a single propeller, 7.3-meter-wide racing plane equipped with 3 electric motors, the one-seat craft will run at 750 volts and produce a combined 1,000 horsepower. With power available from much lower RPM, the E-plane is said to be more stable than conventional craft while also being much quieter. Now, the company said that there will be 6,000 battery cells on board and that it should provide a range of 200 miles between charges. They said, quote, we're monitoring more than 20,000 data points per second, measuring battery voltage, temperature, and overall health of the powertrain, which was responsible for powering the propellers and generating thrust. And the article finishes out that this project certainly appears to be on the up and up, since it has the support of the UK government and also Rolls-Royce, which is the world's second largest plane power plant manufacturer. From GeneralAviationNews.com, a proposed AD could affect almost 20,000 Piper aircraft. The FAA has produced a new AD for inspecting wing spars for certain Piper aircraft, and the list is too long to read, but it starts with the PA 28-140 and runs all the way up through the PA 32-300. Officials estimate that 19,696 aircraft will be affected. According to the FAA, they received a report of a fatigue crack found in the lower main wing spar cap of a Piper PA-28R-201. That would be a Piper Arrow. An investigation revealed that repeated high-load operating conditions accelerated the fatigue crack growth in the lower main wing spar cap. In addition, because of the structural configuration of the wing assembly, the cracked area was inaccessible for a visual inspection. According to the FAA, a review of airplane maintenance records to determine the aircraft's usage and an application of a factored service hour formula will identify when an airplane meets the criteria for the proposed eddy current inspection of the lower main wing spar bolt holes. Only an aircraft of the main wing spar that has a factored service life of 5,000 hours has had either main wing spar replaced with a serviceable main wing spar or has airplane maintenance records that are missing or incomplete must have the eddy current inspection. They said that if the condition is not addressed, the wing could possibly separate from the fuselage in flight. Estimated cost to do the repair, if needed, $8,260 per wing spar. From generalaviationnews.com, sweepstakes that pays you to be a safer pilot. Who would have thought you could get paid for flight training? Well, Paul Berger's trying to make that happen. He's a retired businessman and pilot who founded the Wings Industry Advisory Committee, a coalition of industry representatives, government officials, and individuals dedicated to increasing participation in the FAA Wings Pilot Proficiency Program. The committee's newest effort is a sweepstakes designed to encourage pilots and CFIs to become more invested in the Wings program. A beta test held in 2018 with CFIs who were members of NAFI and SAFE, those are the professional societies for CFIs, proved so successful the program will be opened up in 2019 to all pilots and all CFIs, according to Berger. Paul and his wife put up money for the 29 Wing sweepstakes, a total of $50,000, with $10,000 distributed each year. Prizes include two $1,500 prizes, two $1,000 prizes, two $750 prizes, and two $500 prizes. He reported that only about 67,000 pilots have earned a phase in the Wings program since it began back in 2005. He says that's a very small percentage of pilots in the country, and that's what we want to change. How does it work? Well, when a pilot completes a phase of the Wings program, they'll receive an email that includes an opportunity to participate in the Wings Rewards program, including registering for a chance to win the sweepstakes starting in 2019. The more phases you complete, the more chances you have to win one of the prizes in a random drawing. And I should mention that every 2 years when I have to do my flight review, I use the Wings program, and I also offer it to all the clients that I work with. It's pretty easy to do. Basically, you go out to faasafety.gov, create an account for yourself, take online courses in 3 different flight categories, and then go fly with a flight instructor. And when you do the Wings program, you then don't have to do the 1 hour of ground that's required with a flight instructor when you do a flight review, which, of course, is what used to be called a BFR. And from AINonline.com, experimental aircraft fatalities continue to decline. Fatal accidents in experimental aircraft fell 2% between the FAA's fiscal year 2017 and 2018, according to EAA. They said the fiscal year ending September 2018, fatal accidents totaled 44. In 2018, the total was nearly 14% lower than the FAA's not-to-exceed threshold of 51 fatal accidents for the period. According to EAA Vice President of Advocacy and Safety Sean Elliott, these are historic lows for fatal accidents in amateur-built and experimental category aircraft. The FAA attributes the decline to working closely with the FAA and NTSB on recommendations to reduce fatal accidents, including co-chairing the FAA's General Aviation Joint Steering Committee. Further reducing the accident totals is a continuing challenge, but one that is foremost as part of EAA's missions to boost participation in aviation, said Elliott. And yes, I remember years ago when doing some data analysis, it was very obvious to me that experimental aircraft had a much higher fatal accident rate than certificated aircraft. And it's great to see that this is improving through training and other actions. In international news from avweb.com, China launches a pilot recruitment drive. Now, if there were any doubts that the pilot shortage is real, the South China Morning Post is reporting that China's People's Liberation Army has joined the rest of the aviation world and launched a pilot recruitment drive. The Army has created a flashy promotional video aimed at 17 to 20-year-olds and 2019 high school graduates, and it's focused on their sexiest aircraft, the J-20 stealth fighter. Now, only a few of the selected candidates will actually get to fly the 5th-generation fighter. But like armed forces all over the world, PLA needs pilots for its whole fleet, and like its allies and adversaries, it's offering incentives to fill its cockpits. The recruitment effort covers 31 of the country's 33 provinces, and those who qualify will get a full-ride university education while they train as pilots. Last year, China took in 1,480 new pilot recruits, its largest new class ever, and it needs more. It's cashing in on the economic boom it's enjoyed for the past 20 years and developing potent new aircraft in all roles, adding hundreds of airframes every year. It's particularly interested in countering the perceived threat from U.S. F-22s and F-35s, which are expected to number about 500 in total in the region by 2025. From flyingmag.com, ADS-B rule eliminates RVSM approval process. How's that for alphabet soup? Now, it says that our aircraft equipped with ADS-B out that meet altitude keeping requirements will no longer need to obtain RVSM authorization thanks to new FAA rule. And RVSM, by the way, is reduced vertical separation minimums. Owners of ADS-B out-equipped aircraft can begin RVSM operations without a separate authorization when the new rule goes into effect on January 22nd. The RVSM application process will be eliminated entirely after January 1, 2020, when all aircraft operating in RVSM and other controlled airspace must be ADS-B equipped. Now, aviation authorities first began introducing RVSM rules in 1997, and those were intended to reduce the required vertical separation between aircraft flying between flight level 290 and 410. Back in the bad old days, planes had to stay vertically separated by 2,000 feet. Now it's just 1,000-foot separation up in the flight levels there. Now, eliminating the RVSM authorization process will save aircraft operators time and money, according to the FAA. And by the way, when those rules were introduced back in 97, the cost to upgrade to RVSM was so expensive that I recall some owners of older jets decided to fly at flight level 280 and below, even though it would cost them more in fuel, just to avoid the high cost of installing the new equipment for RVSM. So it's great that this is going to help bring the cost down somewhat. And finally, from vtdigger.org, and I think VT is short for Vermont, a former airline transport pilot is convicted at trial. Convicted drug smuggler on probation for transporting 25 kilograms of marijuana by plane in Iowa has been convicted by a jury in Vermont of flying without a license stemming from a late-night flight into an airport in Rutland County, Vermont. Following a trial in December, a jury returned a verdict finding Angelo Ethematos, 49, guilty of knowingly and willingly piloting an aircraft without an airman's certificate. The charge carries a possible maximum penalty of 2 years in jail. According to the affidavit, his license was revoked due to a criminal conviction in federal court in Iowa. Agents wrote that on February 19, 2013, he was piloting a Piper aircraft, and he was found to be transporting 25 kilograms of marijuana. He pleaded guilty to the charge and was sentenced to serve nearly 5 years in prison. In July 2014, the FAA revoked his pilot license and also stated, according to an affidavit, that, quote, no application for a new airman's certificate will be accepted at any time in the future, lifetime revocation for controlled substance violation. By the way, I have never heard of a lifetime revocation before. I thought that pilots could always go back and apply for new certificates, but apparently in some circumstances that's not the case. Anyway, during the investigation that started back in April, the affidavit stated that DEA agents learned that the pilot was associated with a Piper single-engine aircraft that had been flown between Vermont and Nantucket, Massachusetts. They said that while monitoring that aircraft, investigators observed that there were some flights occurring during daylight hours, and there were multiple that were late at night, appearing to be short in duration. One of these flights took place in April when the aircraft took off at about 10:30 p.m. from Rutland Southern Vermont Regional Airport and landed an hour later in Newport, Rhode Island. The plane then landed back in Rutland about 1 a.m. the next day. Federal agents met the pilot as he walked up to the plane. He provided agents with a pilot's license that had the same number as the one that had been revoked. No drugs or larger amounts of money were found on the plane. When asked, the pilot said he had simply gone to Nantucket to, quote, meet a friend. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, my weekly updates. And then we'll get on to our main topic about the closure threat to Reid-Hillview Airport and what pilots everywhere should be doing to help protect their airport. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Hey, I hope you enjoy that we had new episodes for you every week throughout the holiday seasons. There may come a time in the future where I might not be able to do that every holiday season, but anyway, I was able to fit it in this year and hope you all enjoyed the new content. And let's talk about the listener survey that's been running since October. I want to thank the more than 140 people who filled out surveys and submitted them to me. Thanks for taking the time to fill it out. Here are some of the results. About 45% of you found this show from other podcasts, mostly from Airplane Geeks, where I've been a co-host for about 5 years. But about 25% of you found us by searching in Apple Podcast app or the Apple App Store. And about 8% found us because a friend told them about the show. And along those lines, please, please, please tell your friends about the show. Now, less than 4% of you learned about this show through social media like Twitter and Facebook. And I do have a news survey, which we'll talk about in a moment, which is going to address that. About 75% of you are licensed pilots, 10% of you are student pilots. Others have either retired from flying or are planning to take up flying. On average, pilots who have been listening to the show have been licensed for about 15 years, though 8% of you, like me, have been flying for more than 40 years. 80% of listeners fly for fun, 12% fly professionally in a general aviation job, 4% fly for the military, and 2% fly for the airlines. Now, 82% of listeners are in the United States. Australia came up next with a little over 3%, then Canada with about 3% of the listeners. The United Kingdom is around 2%, and then filling out the top 10 countries that listen to the show around the world, each of them with less than 1%, are Germany, New Zealand, Mexico, Sweden, and France. By the way, I looked at the download stats for our hosting service for the past 3 months, and the show has been downloaded in 137 countries. That's amazing. And I would like to make a special point of thanking our one listener in Liechtenstein. So that's great. Little tiny country in Europe. Now, the median age for people listening to the show is about 48 years, and that's pretty close to the average age of pilots here in the United States. I want to thank everybody for all of their comments. You talked about things that you liked about the show, little tiny things that you'd like to see changed, and of course, a number of suggestions for topics for future shows. And I have read every single word on each and every survey submitted, so I want to thank you so very much for taking your time. I know it takes a while to do this, but it's just invaluable to help guide the show in the future, so thanks again for doing that. Now, we've got a new listener survey that just went live, and that's on social media. Now, after I create each of these shows, I spend a fair amount of time posting on various social media like Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and Instagram so that hopefully more people will find the show. And as you can see from our stats, not a whole lot of people find us through social media. So got a new survey up, trying to figure out where do people like you hang out so that I can target some of my social media posts to those areas. Now, I have done some limited advertising on social media in the past, such as Facebook ads to try and help grow the show. And the information you provide in this new survey will really help me target where I should post information about the show or where I might advertise it to help find new listeners. So if you're on social media, or even if you're not, maybe you hate Twitter and Facebook, and that's fine too, go ahead and take the survey and let me know. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey. Type that in, it'll take you to the survey, and I really appreciate all the feedback that you'll be giving me for that. Thanks so much. And speaking of social media, over the holidays, I created a new YouTube channel. Now, this is separate from my YouTube channel that's under my name, where I post videos of various things involving flight training and things like that. This one is specifically for Aviation News Talk, and I am posting there audio-only videos of every podcast episode that's published. In fact, they're all out there right now. Now, I realize that's not the way most people listen to podcasts, but I have heard that a small percentage of people do use things like YouTube and YouTube Red. In fact, YouTube Red is now called YouTube Premium. That allows you to listen, for example, while you're working at your desktop to YouTube videos running in the background. And it just kind of switches automatically, allows you to open other apps and so on. So if that's of any interest to you, go on out to YouTube and just search for Aviation News Talk. You can do it all as one word, or you can do it as three separate words, Aviation News Talk. And there's also a link to that new channel in our show notes, which you can get to by tapping the image on your smartphone on the podcast player that you're listening to, or just by going out to aviationnewstalk.com, where you find all the show notes for all of our shows. So check it out and let me know if that's something you'd like, and we'll continue that if you do. Now, shortly, I will be headed off to fly to Knoxville, Tennessee, in the back of a Delta Airlines airliner. I'm going to be spending about 4 days out there. This is the annual convention that they hold for their salespeople, but more importantly, for their training partners like me. And so this is an opportunity for people who specialize in teaching the Cirrus to learn the latest information and also to get more in-depth training. So that's an investment I make to just spend the time and the money to fly out there and soak up as much information as I can. And I think that makes, hopefully, me a better flight instructor as well. So you probably know from listening to the show that I specialize in the Cirrus, and I always think it makes sense for flight instructors to specialize. In fact, yesterday, within the space of 5 minutes, I turned down 2 possible clients in aircraft that were not a Cirrus. And one of them, by the way, was an L-39 jet. I just thought, this is not something I know about. I better stick to the airplanes that I absolutely do know. So I think specialization makes a heck of a lot of sense in flight instruction and probably in many other endeavors in life too. And after you're done listening to this show, if you find yourself looking for just a little bit more aviation content, come on out to our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Click on the tab called Post. That's where I post lots of information between episodes, some of which makes it in the show and some which doesn't. But if you feel that you get value from this show, And if you're in a position to donate a few dollars a month, well, you can sign up to do that right there on the Patreon site. That's at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And of course, there's a link to it in our show notes. I'd like to thank our new Patreon supporters who've joined us in the last couple of weeks. They include Stephen Elop, who is one of our new super supporters who donates more than $20 a month. We also have Paul, Dennis Pilarinos, Deb Gangwish, and Reid. Reid, by the way, was our first new supporter in 2019, so thanks so much for that. And also thanks to Preston Root, who sent us a check for several $100s. Preston's from the Daytona Beach area, and he was a radio broadcaster with NASCAR for over 30 years. And best of all, he's a student pilot. So thanks so much. Hey, it's the beginning of the month, and this is when I mention all of our super supporters. These are the folks that donate more than $20 a month, and these people include Jeremy Zwadny. He's a software developer. Peter Long, pilot in Australia, formerly here in Silicon Valley. Seth Lake, who I spoke to over the holidays. He's a military instructor pilot and CFI in Arkansas. You can find out more about his podcast and flight school at go-nogo.aero. Jason Blair, who we talked about earlier in the show, he's a pilot examiner. He runs a blog at jasonblair.net. Joseph Haggerty II, he's a Mooney owner and pilot. Michael Rogers, Cirrus owner and pilot in Southern California. Michael Spain, student pilot in Oklahoma, who's thinking about buying a Cirrus. Larry Noe from New York, New York. He flies a Bonanza G36, but he's actually thinking about a different aircraft that we talked about recently. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation, proud owners of 3 Cessna T240 aircraft. That's essentially the Corvallis. Roger Griggs, he's a turbine guy, over 2,000 hours on a TBM 850, currently flying a new Meridian 600. Chuck Price, who is one of my clients locally here, he works for Too Simple, and they do smart trucks. So think big rigs that can drive themselves. Go out to tusimple.ai if you want to learn more about that. Don Dillman, a professional pilot who runs a large training center for a major air carrier. By the way, I just saw on LinkedIn that he's got a new job, a vice president job. So congratulations to Don. Stella Sue, she's a student pilot in the SR-20, and on our Patreon site, you can find a video that she and I shot that was streamed live while we were flying. Jonathan Weisswasser, vascular surgeon, also a ham radio operator, also inactive ham like me. These days he flies a Meridian. Jim Barrett, he runs Sonics ESD. They specialize in active noise control. He flies a Cirrus SR-22 out of Monterey. Fabio Camlos, who's an SR-22 owner locally here. Lance Fletcher, former crew chief in the Air Force on the F-111, who's looking to start to fly soon. Moj Cassie, who's a software developer in Silicon Valley, who's been helping me with our website. Tyson Weiss, co-founder, CEO of ForeFlight. Thanks so much. You all know ForeFlight, I'm sure. Adam Nunn flies a Piper Cherokee in Texas. Chris Carnahan, who flies a 1955 VTOL Bonanza out of St. Louis, Missouri. Anthony Pitt, private pilot in sunny Brisbane, Australia, flies a 172 out of the Redcliffe Airport. And Jeffrey Bell, he's a general surgeon who's working on his CFI certificate. Congratulations on that. Great certificate to work on. David DeCurtis recently stepped up into the Honda Jet after 14 years of flying a Cirrus. Ed Varso, who spent the last 20 years in law enforcement, and he's a member of the Riverside Pilots Flying Club in Southern California. Antoine Hanekom, who I flew with back in November in Australia. He owns a Cirrus. Jack Downey is the new owner of a SR-22 in Boulder, Colorado. He bought a 2002 model. He's looking for a partner. If you want to become a partner in that plane, email him at cirrus@jackdowney.co. Paul Peterson, he's a CFI in Livermore, California. By the way, that's where AOPA is going to hold their regional fly-in on the West Coast later this year. Peter Alberti, he's got the CFIskills.com website. Glenn Neeson, software guy working on his instrument and commercial. Chris Ostrowski, he's an aerospace physiologist for the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, and he flies a Piper Comanche. Stephen Elop, he flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation M2. And those are our supporters. Thanks so much. I appreciate your contributions and the contributions of everyone who helps support the show in whatever way that you do. And next up, we're going to be talking with Walt Geiger about the threatened closure of San Jose's Reid-Hillview Airport and what pilots should be doing everywhere to help preserve their airport. Right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Earlier this week, I was reading a blog post on avweb.com written by Dana Nickerson. It's called Can Grassroots Flying Solve the Pilot Shortage? Interesting things in there, talking about how it's harder and harder for people to get into small airplanes to learn to fly. But there's another threat that's probably just as big, and that is the demise of airports. Santa Monica Airport closure was widely discussed, and the Reid-Hillview Airport, which is comparable in many ways, a very large airport here in Northern California, is once again under threat of closure. So I talked with Walt Geiger, and let me tell you first a little bit about Walt. He owns the Tradewinds Aviation Flight School based at the Reid-Hillview Airport in San Jose, California. He's also the founder of CAPSO. Now, that's the Community and Airport Partnership for Safe Operations. And like me, in a previous life, Walt spent over 25 years working in high tech, and we actually worked for competitors. These days, Walt is a great friend of mine, and more importantly, he's a champion of general aviation. And here's that conversation. So, Walt, tell me a little bit about Reid-Hillview's role as an airport in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Well, Reid-Hillview, as many other GA airports, has a multi-function in terms of training, recreational purposes, business, and so forth. What stands out here at Reid-Hillview Airport is the San Jose State University program, where the university is offering a career program for folks who want to become airline pilots. A number of folks are using this airport as their business hub. In other words, they fly into Reid-Hillview and do their business in Silicon Valley and fly back home again. And we see that a fair amount of time where people come in from the valley, from other states, whatnot, to do business here in the Silicon Valley and use Reid-Hillview as their hub. The one other thing that's important for this airport is designated as a reliever airport for San Jose International. San Jose International is a growing international airport, and they do not really like GA traffic as San Jose International, so they can grow their business. So the FAA designated Reid-Hillview as a reliever airport for that purpose. It's a community asset in terms of local schools who come and visit the airport and see airplanes close up and get an explanation why airplanes fly. So elementary school kids as well as high school kids come frequently to the airport as a source of information for their project or whatever they're working on. So again, Reid-Hillview serves many different purposes, and it's an important asset to the community.
Yeah, it's hard not to compare Reid-Hillview to Santa Monica, being located right next to a major international airport. Talk about some of the recent actions by the County Board of Supervisors and what those mean for the future of the airport.
Well, that's, again, an excellent question here. You know, the recent action is one of many, and it goes as far back as 40 years, where a number of people want to see this airport to be converted into something else. The county supervisor decided about 3 weeks ago that they don't want to accept FAA grants or continue to do so, not to accept grants since 2011. So they seem to be under the impression, well, we can run this airport by ourselves. We don't need the FAA to be involved, but more importantly, not to have the obligations that the FAA applies to grants to keep the airport running for at least 20 years from the time they accepted the grant. So the idea here is, well, once we are out of the obligations in 2031, which is 20 years from 2011, then we can do with the property whatever we like doing, which is kind of not true because there are other obligations the county has with the FAA due to land purchases. So that was one decision made 3 weeks ago. The other item that the supervisors wanted the staff to look into is to consolidate Reid-Hillview with San Martin. Now you know that the county runs these two airports, so Reid-Hillview and San Martin are both part of the county airport operation, and some people believe now, well, we don't really need two airports, we could do with one. Why don't you move everybody from Reid-Hillview to San Martin and everybody's happy? Well, the staff will have to look into the feasibility of doing that, and it's not all that certain that this is going to be a good idea. The last one that took all of us by surprise, because it came in the last minute, was somebody brought up the lead issue, which is obviously something that everybody is concerned about. But what some people are trying to do here is to correlate the elevated blood levels in some of the children's blood around here in the neighborhood, which other neighborhoods see too. But these people are trying to link the fact that we use F-gas that is leaded with the lead in the children's blood level, which is unfounded, not scientifically proven correlation, but it was enough to stir up a number of people said, oh, we have a problem here. And now a report needs to be done to prove what impact lead in F-gas has to the children's elevated blood, lead in the blood. That's an absolutely fallacy. From what I can tell, there's no proof that airborne lead can get into the blood. But we need a report that's scientific, that's based on facts, rather than just some fantasy of people who are really trying to find any way to put the airport in discredit, and obviously with the purpose of using that land for something else.
So I recall that there have been attempts in my memory back in 1996 and again in 2008, and probably attempts even prior to that to close the airport. Is there any common theme? Does the county have some alternate use in mind for the airport?
That's absolutely the theme here. One has to realize this airport, while it back in 1960, 70 and so forth was all by itself out in the field somewhere, over time, as the community grew, houses were built around the airport. Obviously, well knowing that, hey, here's an airport and my house is now close to an airport. But that's besides the point. The community, San Jose, grew, and there are now 1 million people in this area. And obviously, there's pressure for affordable housing, parks, you name it. And some people believe, well, the reason why our houses are not affordable anymore is because here's an airport, which again is a correlation that's kind of out of thin air in my mind.
So tell us a little bit about CAPSO and the efforts of CAPSO to try and protect the airport.
Well, CAPSO being the Community and Airport Partnership for Safe Operations. I know it's a little bit of a mouthful. So CAPSO is organizing the community. We inform people about what's going on the political level. We put out facts about the airport so people are not guessing what the real facts are. So you could call it an airport association. Problem here is that we did not have an organized work here at the airport after the Airport Association back in 2000 or 1965 or whatever it was dissolved. So we didn't have established communication to our neighbors, supervisors, airport commission, and we didn't develop any coalitions with stakeholders at the airport. So that's what we are doing now. It's kind of late in the game, but we got the wake-up call about 2 years ago. Said, hey, the county is trying to do something that we do not like. So nobody was really paying attention before that. And we realized about 2 years ago, roughly, that we need to organize ourselves. And I would encourage just about every airport, if they don't already have an airport association, to look into building that coalition with stakeholders, reach out to the community, be in the face of the politicians if things don't look right. On the other hand, if there are politicians out there who really like supporting the airport, obviously they need to get some feedback from the pilot community as well. So what we are learning here is, unless you have an organization who is capable to reach out and talk to people, things might not go the way you want it to go.
And what are some of the kind of ways that you're reaching out to the local neighborhoods?
We have organized meetings with politicians, with candidates who were running for a supervisor seat, and invited them to the airport, show them around, and have explained to us what they think about the airport and if they want to support the airport. We have had member meetings, just informational meetings. We organized speakers for the supervisor and other public meetings, rather, which there are many in the last year or so. So we kind of were the coordination of speakers who were able to talk to a particular subject with knowledge. And that's the key here as well, is we don't want to just put out fantasies or whatever. We really need to talk about facts and what the real issues are. So CAPSO is still in the grow-up process. So we have about 150 members now, which is good. So we are able to start to get some traction with the members as well as the elected officials.
So in general, for pilots anywhere, what would you advise them that they should do to help work on protecting their own local airport?
Well, if you haven't already done so, become active. Engage with the community, politicians, speak up, and be supportive. I think it's important to communicate. It's important to know the people who make the decisions, but you want to make sure that those folks make decisions based on facts. I think that's the advice I would make to everybody if they don't already do so. And I'm pretty sure there are lots of airports who have airport associations, people who look out for the well-being of the airport. You need to continue to do that. If you don't already do so, then I strongly encourage to start a group that's concerned about what's going on with the airport.
And let's talk about our local situation. Do you have any specific calls to action for California-based pilots? What would you like them to do to help in this fight to save Reid-Hillview?
Absolutely. Yeah, so as we go forward now, if you've heard from the actions or decisions being made a couple of weeks ago by the supervisors, we need to convince them to take FAA money, which is the way the system is being designed here in the United States, is to support airports through the FAA. So that's one action that we need to push forward and make sure that they understand taking FAA money is the key. Obviously, there's a commitment, which is obviously what we want as well. We just need to demonstrate the value of the airport to the supervisors. What we have been telling folks is, hey, now it's time to speak up. Let your supervisor know that you're concerned about the airport. Then tell them what you see in terms of value for the airport to you. And by the way, you're a voter too. So you want to let them know that you're concerned about decisions being made, but you also demonstrate that you have some power to change direction if necessary as a voter. So that's our kind of generic call to action. We'll continuously monitor meetings that are coming up. We'll participate in those meetings to make sure our voice is heard. We also need to be constructive. So at the end of the day, any confrontation like this needs to come to a mutual agreement in some way or another. So we need to reach out as well to make sure that we find a solution that all of us can live with.
And I remember back in 2008, one of the calls to action was for anybody who knows one of the 5 Santa Clara County supervisors to make an appointment with them and to basically explain to that supervisor face-to-face why Reid-Hillview was important to them and explain what it would mean to them personally if the airport were taken away. Where do people find out more about CAPSO and how do they join?
Well, that's very easy. So we do have a website, of course. It's called CAPSO, CAAPSO.org. And there's a membership sign-up form. You find all kinds of information about the current situation. So that's the easiest way to get in touch with us. So as soon as we have you on a mailing list, then you will get regular updates on meetings, on the next step in the process. So our motto here is we are securing the future of Reid-Hillview Airport. And CAPSO.org is the place to go for you.
Is there any cost to join?
It's very simple. It's a $20 membership fee per year to help us with our effort. We do mailings. We need to run DART and things like this. So your money is well spent there. And you like your participation too. So we need volunteers to support the high school outreach program. We need volunteers there too. And the big event coming up next year, which is another community outreach, is Airport Day. Airport Day is going to be organized by CAPSO next year. And so that's our opportunity to reach out to the local community.
Well, I will definitely go out and sign up today to join the CAPSO, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes so other people can easily find it and sign up as well. As we start to wrap up here, any final thoughts about Reid-Hillview and what pilots should be doing either for our airport or for their airport elsewhere?
Well, yes, you need to speak up. That's what I have to learn too. You can't just be here and hope for the best. Yeah, and I've learned now over time, as soon as you speak up and let people know what you think and what impact their decision might have, things can change. Might not be immediately, but over time, being consistent and communicate with other folks, that will have an impact. Now, I know these days might not be the day where you think that verbal communication makes a huge difference, but it does. So elected officials like to know what their constituency thinks, and that's your opportunity to speak up.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for taking time to talk with us today about Reid-Hillview Airport, and we definitely support you, and we'll do everything we can to help you succeed here with the airport.
Well, I appreciate your opportunity, the opportunity to speak at your podcast, Max. I know you're doing a great job informing people about all kinds of things, and you have been doing so for a long time, and appreciate for me being at your show today.
So one thing you can do to help support this particular airport is join CAPSO. You can go out to the website at capso.org. That's CAAPSO.org. Go ahead and sign up as a member and also sign up to get their newsletters. Coming up next, listener feedback right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Let's get to feedback from listeners. This is an email from Bob Luton, who's also a Patreon supporter. He says, I'm a San Francisco Bay Area aircraft insurance broker and underwriter, retired after 30 years, occasionally hired as an expert witness. He says, I routinely access the public access database of FAA certificated pilots. After listening to your description of your Cirrus Vision Jet training, I looked up your certificates mostly because I wanted to see how the FAA would designate your new type rating. I was amazed to find that you hold an FAA airline transport certificate for all 4 airplane categories, SEL, MEL, SES, and MES. I don't believe that in my years of checking pilot credentials, I've ever discovered anyone with all 4 ATP ratings. And then Bob gave a suggestion for a future topic. Well, Bob, I know of one other person who has all 4 ATPs, and that's Martha King. And here's an email from Christopher in South Carolina. He says he enjoyed our series on carbon monoxide poisoning. One thing I did not hear you mention is running lean of peak. And then he quoted from the AvWeb article written by Mike Bush in 2003 that I had mentioned in the show, though I didn't mention this particular point that he quoted. And it is, a 4th step would be make sure that your engine is leaned aggressively to minimize the CO content of the exhaust, remembering that CO is produced by incomplete combustion of fossil fuels. This trick is especially useful when high levels of CO are detected during ground operation. Many pilots taxi around with a mixture full rich, and that's like driving a car with a choke full on. Over-rich mixtures result in CO-rich exhaust. Lean for maximum RPM rise at idle, and the CO level will plummet, and your engine will stay cleaner and won't follow its spark plugs. Thanks, Christopher. I'll go ahead and include a link in the show notes to that particular article. And here's an email from Jonathan Weisswasser, one of our Patreon super supporters. He said, really enjoyed your recent episode on SIDS and stars. Indeed, one of those things that makes the transition from my RV8 to my Meridian and the flight levels more interesting. He has a couple of observations. He says, first, there are some SIDs which do not have a discrete route per se, such as the Capital One departure at KIAD. They tend to have a short departure procedure and then a graphic of all surrounding waypoints, which are usually one of the first waypoints in the clearance. And yes, those I believe are called vector DPs. I did mention them briefly in the episode, but I didn't really talk about them in much detail other than to say that you won't find them in your GPS. He continues, it may be worth mentioning that when assigned a SID, clearance will not give you a departure frequency. Also worth noting is the top altitude and its significance. Second, he says, loading a full rival when only being vectored to an intermediate waypoint and then highlighting the waypoint and going direct, as opposed to deleting everything in the sequences up to that, has another advantage over it just being less work. And I had mentioned in the show that pilot I was flying with had deleted the first part of the arrival that he wasn't told to fly, and that I probably wouldn't have done it that way. And sounds like Jonathan, he agrees. He says if ADC decides to change your assignment, as they often do, and direct you to a preceding waypoint, the advantage is you already have it loaded in the system. Otherwise, you'd have to reload that arrival. He says the same principle applies to approaches, which is why he never uses the vectors to final function when loading an instrument approach. He says, as far as speed restrictions, my experience has been that if you file for an en route airspeed less than the minimum required for an arrival, they will not include a star with a higher speed requirement as part of your clearance. He says, occasionally I'm asked in flight if I'm capable of flying the XYZ arrival. It's important to really study it before accepting it, especially if there are speed restrictions. Yes, that's definitely the case. He says it would be useful to mention crossing restrictions, as that's a far more common phenomenon than stars in my experience. He says the G1000 makes that very easy, but it would be interesting to know what techniques are available to non-TAA pilots to make those calculations quickly. TAA would be technically advanced aircraft. Finally, he says PDC is great, and I strongly encourage anyone who flies IFR into big airports to get it. PDC, of course, is the function we talked about in ForeFlight, which is the pre-departure clearances, where you can get your IFR clearance via email or text. And now here's feedback from Travis regarding arrivals.
Hi, Max. Travis here. In regards to your podcast talking about flying arrivals in the Vision Jet, I thought it was interesting that you didn't mention using the VNAV function to meet the altitude restrictions on a descend via clearance, which is a pretty handy function in that aircraft. Also worth noting that in that particular implementation of the G3000, climb via is not supported, which you can do in other implementations of the G3000. You also mentioned that when loading up stars with transitions, that if you were flying the route procedure, that you had to load a particular transition and then either go through and delete the waypoints or go direct to the route of the transition, which is kind of a Garminism. Collins ProLine, you can absolutely load a arrival without any transitions. Just thought that those were interesting things to note, in particular with the Vision Jet G3000.
And Travis, thanks so much for your feedback. And for anyone who'd like to leave us audio feedback or leave a listener question, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and at the top of the page, click on listener questions. Or you can go ahead and use the voice memo function on a smartphone, talking to your smartphone, and email that to me here. And don't forget to check out our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. You can click on posts and see what we posted there. And of course, if someday you're thinking you might be buying a Cirrus, well, contact me today. Like I mentioned before, I can help arrange a free demo flight if you're thinking about buying a new Cirrus. I can help you understand all the different trade-offs in buying new versus used. And I work with Cirrus aircraft folks around the world. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, please, please, please tell one of your friends about how they can find the Aviation News Talk podcast. If they don't know what a podcast is, and 3/4 of the people out there don't, just go ahead and show them on their phone how they can go into the App Store, same place they'd go download any app, and download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app. Just search for Aviation News Talk. And until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.